Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. After hearing that, I'm looking forward to what I've got to say. In terms of Labour, can I just say that, just to put your minds at rest, that's past tense. Past tense. I was a Labour member from a very early age, from around about 1985, when I was about 20, 21, up until Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party. I've not voted for Labour for a long time, probably because of the same reasons that many of you will have, because of their extremism, because of their politics, and because of this issue, which is very close to my heart, which is Israel and Britain's relationship with Israel. And while I was involved in politics, I always felt that there was an opportunity for me to make a difference. And I have to tell you that, as someone who grew up in the west of Scotland in the early 70s, and someone who witnessed, my father's unemployment through no fault of his own. I witnessed us moving a family of 7, 5 children, mum and dad, moving from a 3-bedroom house where my brother and I shared the room, and my 3 sisters shared another room. When we moved to a new house in 1976, which had been built by the then Labour government, and I moved to a new school which had been built by a new Labour government. It's not hard to imagine why someone like me would be brought up supporting the Labour Party, but that party is no longer in existence, and sadly, and ultimately, people have to make choices based on what is in front of them, and so therefore, from a personal political point of view, I have had to make some tough decisions over the last few years, but they're decisions I'm completely comfortable with. And in terms of my background, brought up in the west of Scotland, I was a civil servant from 1982 till 1992, working in the Department for International Development. And then in 1992, I left the civil service and I became a full-time trade union official, which was negotiating, representing workers who worked in the civil service. And in 1999, I crossed over the two paths to become a local councillor for the Labour Party, and in 2010 I was elected to Parliament, and I had the longest parliamentary name of any other constituency, and one which many, I have to tell you, of my English friends and colleagues found great difficulty pronouncing, which was the constituency of East Kilbride. That part was easy. Lesmahagow and Straven, and even the Speaker of the House of Commons mangled that name and several times. So my background in terms of my links to Israel were pretty simple. As someone who grew up in the shadow of the Second World War, a very long shadow, because of course I was born in 1964, but bear in mind that was only 19 years after the war had ended. But someone who grew up and saw the bigotry against the Jewish people, and as Robin will know, coming from the island of Ireland, the position is that we've had a lot of history of bigotry in our country, and sadly that bigotry was also transformed or transported to the west of Scotland, where you had that divide between Protestants and Catholics. And I witnessed people who didn't get, and I saw people not getting jobs because of their religion, because of their faith, because of the school they went to. And I thought that was inherently unjust. And although it doesn't bear any relationship to the type of the tragedies that the Jewish people have had to face for thousands of years, it gave me at least a sense of what it felt like to be the outsider for people who you knew who didn't get jobs because of their background, because of their faith. So that was my first love of Israel, came from the injustices that were carried out against the Jewish people. But the second one, and this was really key for me, was how this tiny little nation in the southeastern shores of the Mediterranean had done so much for the world since its rebirth in 1948. And those were the two issues combined, which made me a loyal follower and supporter of Israel. So by the time I arrived in Parliament in 2010, there was never any doubt for me that I would always speak up for Israel when I was doing that job. And the funny thing was, I immediately met this young guy called Ben Garrett. And Ben Garrett worked for Labour Friends of Israel. Now, normally his job involved, he told me this later, normally his job involved a very hard sell for new MPs to follow or to back or support in any way the state of Israel, because these people were coming from a position where they'd been indoctrinated to support the Palestinian cause without knowing the history, without knowing the facts. It was just Israel bad, Palestinians good, which I hope that most of you will know is not correct. So therefore, he was pretty astonished that when he met me for the first day, I said, no problem, where do I sign up? And thereafter, I made the commitment to him that if ever he needed any help in relation to supporting Israel in the House of Commons, if there was any tough decisions that had to be made or tough contributions, because bear in mind, you know, the House of Commons chamber can comfortably fit around 400 people, but there are 650 MPs. So when you're in there, it's a real bear pit of an atmosphere, and it can be quite intimidating. So even for a rough and tumble Scotsman from the west of the country, so I gave that commitment to Ben, and I think I lived up to it, because when Israel was under attack, I was the one who stood up and defended its right to defend itself against rocket attacks from Hamas and other groups, defended its right to look after its citizens and its borders, and defended it against the calumnies which routinely came its way in terms of this allegation that they lock up children, that they treat Palestinians badly, that people don't have equal rights in Israel, all untrue. And so therefore I was, if you like, the go-to person at that time. And the funny thing is that I had more people behind me, i.e. my colleagues, who were disgusted with me, whilst on the other side of the House of Commons in the Conservative Party, I was having people cheering me on and saying, well done for standing up for Israel. So I did maybe have a premonition that I wasn't on the right side of the House of Commons at that point, but nonetheless, I saw out the 5 years, and unfortunately the Scottish independence referendum, where, you know, I very happily stood up in defence of the Union, which has served us well for well over 300 years. People like me paid the price because the nationalists were re-elected, and they still have a beguiling hold over the people of Scotland, despite the fact that they're failing in so many parts of the politics. But that's my background, that's my history. When I left politics in 2015, I have to say to you that I didn't know what I was going to do next, because I couldn't go back to the trade union movement, because when I was in the trade union movement, my boss was a very moderate trade union leader. He did the things that you'd expect trade unions to do, which was defend workers, try and get good pay, good conditions of service, and not go and strike every 5 minutes. My claim to fame in my whole trade union career is that I organised one half-day strike in my whole career, because I took the view that if you were organising strikes, then you were failing in your job to negotiate the best conditions and paying conditions for the members that you represented. So I couldn't go back to the trade union movement, because by that time the trade unions had been taken over by people like Len McCluskey and real hard left people who would never have any question of hiring someone like me, who was a moderate centre-left Labour MP, and despite the fact that I had a trade union and working class background. So I wondered what I was going to do. And then I came across, and I take the view that, you know, one door closes and another opens, and the door that opened was a guy called Josh Swidler. Now, Josh had been contacted during the 2015 general election campaign, and by people who knew me, and they said to him, listen, we need to get this guy back into the House of Commons, because he's a supporter of Israel, he's very brave, very bold, and he'll stand up and he says what he thinks. So Josh contacted me. I never met the guy in my life. And his wife and Josh both made donations to my campaign that year. So they bought stamps and stuff like that. So I think they made a total donation of around about £5,000, which I was delighted about. Unfortunately, I didn't get elected. So I went to see Josh in London after the election, when you're tidying up all your affairs. You've got a flat which you have to sort of, make sure everything's done and dusted, and you have to sign off and cross all the T's and dot the I's for the parliamentary authorities. And I just went to see Josh to thank him for giving me the support and apologise for not being able to do better in the election. And he asked me this question: what's wrong with Israel advocacy in the United Kingdom? And here was my simple answer: there isn't any. It doesn't exist. And there's a whole complicated story about why it doesn't exist, but let me give you it in a nutshell. The big Jewish community organisations like the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council have particular roles. They have to be, by dint of the organisations that they are, extremely diplomatic in how they behave, but they never cultivated any links with ordinary MPs. They were quite happy to have links with, the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister, whether that was Tony Blair, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, John Major. It didn't matter who the Premier was. They always had a strong relationship. But of course, and I jump ahead a little bit here, but when you have someone like Jeremy Corbyn as a leader of a party with the potential to be a Prime Minister, then that changes the dynamics a little bit. So I explained to Josh, I said, look, the community don't do it. They think it's fine just to have the relationships with the top politicians, and they don't really spend any time with anybody else. Meanwhile, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and all the other groups that coalesce around the Palestinian cause, like the groups that have got Palestine Friends of the Middle East and all these types of groups, they all very actively campaign on behalf of the Palestinians. And I explained to Josh that because the Israeli advocates neglected Parliament, we had a whole load of MPs, particularly Labour, who were coming into Parliament and had a completely jaundiced view of Israel, the state of Israel, the history of Israel, the history of the Jewish people. They had no clue, and they were completely beholden to the trade union movement, who had very strong links to the Palestinian cause, which meant that if you were given, say, for example, £2,000 or £3,000 in your election campaign by a trade union, you would be expected to support the causes that they supported, including the Palestinian cause. And it wasn't based on right, wrong, facts, nothing like that at all. It was just based on, we're backing you and you have to back the issues that we believe in. So the community had completely neglected the whole Israel advocacy issue. And we had allowed, and you'll all know the history, but we had allowed the Arabs who had invaded Israel on the 15th of May 1948 after Ben Gurion had declared independence the previous day. We'd allowed this myth to develop that somehow that Israel, the Jewish people, were aggressors and that the Palestinians were the victims, when the opposite was the case. And of course, the Arabs never actually became the Palestinians until the 60s. That's where people in this country, like the hippies, like Jeremy Corbyn and co, all hopped on to the Palestinian bandwagon. Instead of Israel selling itself, explaining to politicians across the world, the difficulty it had faced becoming a tiny little nation and developing into a very powerful nation, albeit small, instead of explaining to the world all the great things it had done, they became very insular. They didn't go out and defend themselves. They just defended their country. And that's defending your country militarily was necessary in 1948. It was necessary in 1967. It was necessary in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And it was necessary thereafter when all the intifadas took place and all the terrorist attacks. And to this day, it's still necessary for them to defend themselves. But they neglected from the 60s onwards to fight the propaganda battle. And that had led to the situation where, and I will break it down for you, the Labour Party were virtually, I would say 70% against Israel, 10% indifferent, 20% for. The Conservative Party, the statistics were the opposite. You're probably talking about 80% supportive of Israel, 10% indifferent and 10% against. And those figures have changed a little. And the Liberal Democrats, quite frankly, just blow with the wind and tell you whatever you think. They'll say, yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, until you find out they're saying exactly the same thing to the person that's got completely opposite views to you. So the situation that I explained that to them. And I said, look, there's loads of organizations that think they're being political and advocating for Israel, but they're not doing it. And I don't mean, I'm not being in any way insensitive to the work that the people did, or in any way try to undermine them. It's just that if you've worked in politics and you know how politics operate and how you make changes and how you influence events, then as a profession, and whether we like it or not, and being an amateur doesn't really work. So when the Palestinians were arranging a campaign, they were sending thousands of letters, which then became emails, to politicians saying, I want you to support my cause. I used to get them. During Operation Protective Edge, I got probably 100, 200 letters from people who said to me, you must condemn Israel for this outrage that they're carrying out against the Palestinian people. You must ensure that we stop selling them weapons. We must boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for all its behaviour. And we expect you to do that as our MP. This is the response they got back from me. No. Here's the truth. Israel didn't attack anyone. Hamas attacked Israel, and Israel is defending itself. And incidentally, you can imagine that didn't go down very well, but the bottom line was I wasn't going to play around with my truth because I know the facts, I know the background. So that's the situation. But let me tell you this. At that time, from the period 2010 to 2015, this is how many letters and emails I got supporting Israel. Zero. None. None whatsoever. And Daniel Taub, who was the Israeli ambassador between 2010 and 2015 when I was there, Daniel and I knew him pretty well. He's a really top-class brain and a top-class individual. And he said to me, Michael, during Operation Protective Edge, I get taken in to the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, or Foreign and Commonwealth Office as it was then. And the formal wording for these events is a démarche. I don't know names, maybe someone does here, but basically it's a dressing down. You've been given a dressing down by the government, and they were saying to Israel, and this is what Foreign Office Minister said to Daniel Taub, we do apologise, but we do have to criticise you for the defence you're putting in against the Palestinians, because here's all the letters and emails we've got from all the Palestinian supporters in the UK. And incidentally, here's yours, a handful. And so therefore, the government was just reacting to public opinion in the UK. And here was my position. I was an MP at the time. I said, but Daniel, we know there's tens of thousands of people out there that support Israel. The only problem is they're not being given an opportunity to express their opinions, and not everybody is comfortable in letter writing or explaining themselves. And sometimes they need a bit of help and support. That's exactly what the Palestinian side were doing, our opponents were doing. They were giving people pre-prepared letters to send to their MPs and call for their support. And let me tell you, this might surprise you. Most MPs are not fine, upstanding people. There's some of them aren't very good. And what they'll do is they'll blow with the wind. So whoever contacts them and makes a case, they'll say, yeah, I support you. So what happened during for example, Operation Protective Edge, people were asked to condemn Israel. And you had three types of politician. You had the politicians that support Israel, which we'll come back to in a second. the politicians who don't know anything about foreign policy and just blow with the wind, and the politicians that are against Israel. Now, the first group, the politicians against Israel, are delighted when they get all those messages condemning Israel, because they can stand up in the House of Commons chamber and say, I have received thousands of letters, hundreds of letters from my constituents condemning Israel. The ambiguous group who just blow with the wind either way, they'll just go with whoever they think they'll please. So they'll stand up and say, I've had lots of letters from my constituents saying, criticize Israel, blah, blah, blah. And then the group that do support Israel, well, they're not all brave. They're not all brave. And that means that they can be, if they feel that there's too many people against them, they'll be frightened off from going into the chamber, speaking out and supporting Israel, despite the fact that they actually do support Israel. And I'm afraid that there's a number of people in the House of Commons, but when I was there, and still remains the case today, who tell you that they support Israel, but never actually say anything about Israel. And I'll give you an example. Liam Byrne. Do you remember Liam Byrne, who wrote the famous note saying there's no money left? Do you remember him? Liam Byrne is a 100% decent individual. I was his parliamentary private secretary when he was at the Department for Work and Pensions. He was a shadow Secretary of State. Liam's a good guy, but we were sitting one night talking after the business and about a couple of things. And I said, well, why don't you support Israel? And Liam had explained, he said, well, I've got a huge Muslim community in my constituency. And if I stand up for Israel publicly, then I'll be condemned and they won't vote for me. And I said to him, well, I think you're maybe taking that a bit too far, because who else are they going to vote for? There's nobody else going to hold the same views as you do on other matters. And I wouldn't be so pessimistic. But nonetheless, and people get criticised for this and they call it Islamophobia. It's not Islamophobia. It's a fact of life that if you've got a pressure group inside a constituency and they exert their pressure and there are big enough numbers to create either to stop you getting elected or to get someone else elected, then you're going to try and pander to them. And there's far too many people in politics in the UK who are pandering to the Palestinian cause because of those circumstances. So go back to Josh. Josh said to me, well, what would you do about it? And my advice was this. At that time, I had no idea this was going down the route of I'd still be in this, I'd be organising the IBA. But nonetheless, I said, look, I would get everyone together who currently exists, who thinks that they're doing advocacy work. And I would say to them, why don't we reorganise ourselves so that every time we start a campaign, we all do the same thing? So rather than your people sending 20 or 30 letters, another group in Scotland or in Northern Ireland or in, you know, the South Coast or whatever, sending 100 letters, why don't we all combine and come together and use all the information that we have in terms of our membership databases, whether that was Zionist Federation UK, Christians United for Israel, Christian Friends of Israel, Sussex Friends of Israel, you know, Northwest Friends of Israel, Federation of Friends of Israel Scotland, and the other groups in Wales. Doesn't matter what the name is, why don't we bring everyone together onto the same platform and ask them to take action at the same time? So next thing I know, the guys asked me to do a bit of work and to investigate whether that would work. That was in August 2015. And 6 months later, they asked me to set up the Israel-Britain Alliance. And the funny thing is, I'm just writing the 2021 annual report, and it just reminded me that in the first year, the first campaign that we ran, we got 1,387 emails sent from all across the country to members of parliament. And that equates to 2 emails for every MP, although that was spread around. So many MPs would have got no communication. Some MPs would have got lots, a lot more. So in the first year, we sent in total for all the campaigns that we ran, 11,191. 2017, we sent just under 30,000. 2018, we went up to 66,000. 2019, 70,000. 2020, just under 80,000. And in 2021, the year that's just been completed, we sent over 150,000 emails to MPs, government departments, and we had some huge successes in 2021. We banned Hamas. The Iranian backed terror group, which has caused every war since they took over the Gaza Strip in 2005. These people have caused countless deaths, not just in the Israeli side, but of their own people. And I was amazed to find out that the organisation wasn't banned in the UK. So you could walk down the street with a Hamas flag and you wouldn't be arrested. Now that's changed. After our campaigning, and I don't take all the credit, other people have put in work on this subject as well, but the bottom line was, finally, Priti Patel said enough's enough, and she banned Hamas. That means if Jeremy Corbyn, who bear in mind called Hamas his friends, do you remember that story about when he was laying wreaths down at the people who murdered the athletes in Munich in 1972? That this guy, Jeremy Corbyn, who supports Hamas, if he says that anywhere in the UK, he can be arrested. And there's a little bit of me hopes that he does say it so that he does get arrested. But I'll leave that to that's just my personal opinion. But in terms of the other things that we managed to do in 2021, the Durban 4 conference and don't laugh, this is an anti-racism conference. And it was meant to take place, it was taking place in New York in September. The first Durban conference back in 2001 became a hate fest against Israel. Speakers were anti-Semitic. Speakers said a lot of terrible things. And I have to say to you, and I hope you don't think this is controversial, because I'm going to say it anyway, that all the plaudits that were awarded to Bishop Desmond Tutu, I don't agree with any of them, because when it came to Israel and when it came to his views of the Jewish people, he was an anti-Semite. No doubt in my mind that he was an anti-Semite, and it might offend some people, but I look at the facts and I make my own judgments on them. So we managed to convince the British government not to send a delegation to the Durban conference in New York in September, which was important because we couldn't have a situation where British government was endorsing a conference which had been anti-Semitic since its very inception. We ran other campaigns in 2021 about Israel Apartheid Week, and we reduced the number of events on Israel Apartheid Week to the lowest they've ever been in university campuses, because the universities are scared that we will highlight them as an estate who would allow these events to take place under their jurisdiction. And we highlighted issues like the Ben and Jerry ban, when they banned, selling ice cream in the disputed territories, that's Judea and Samaria to you and I. When they said we're not going to sell any more of our ice cream, I never ate this stuff anyway, so it was no skin off my nose. But the bottom line is that we sent over 12,000 letters to the chief executive of Unilever, Alan Jope, and the decisions that have been taken, and a lot of them have been in America, where pension funds have withdrawn their money from Unilever. It's all having an effect, because if people want to say, we're not supporting Israel, like Ben and Jerry, these hippie style people who want to say they're not going to support the only Jewish state in the world, then they can face the consequences. And I think you'll enjoy this one. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign run a winter lobby day, and this year, and we always send out counter information to the PSC on the PSC lobby, which we correct what they've said. So this year they said that Israel was an apartheid state, and they also condemned the Israeli government's action in banning 6 NGOs that had links to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a terrorist organization. So we rebutted that information, but here's the joke. Do you know that our supporters sent more emails, more letters to MPs than the PSC campaign generated in its totality? So MPs were saying, I've had more letters giving me the facts about this information than I have from the people who they were writing about in the first place, which tells you a lot about the dynamics that have changed. So since I was in Parliament, I wish I was in Parliament, if for no other reason now, that I wish I was in the receiving end of all these letters from Israel supporters across the UK, because I would be delighted to say to every single one of them, it would be a very short response. I support you 100%. I agree with you 100%. And I'm going to say that in the House of Commons chamber. because I never get that opportunity to do that when I served in Parliament. So in terms of where it all started, that's where it came from. The kernel of an idea, a discussion between myself and Josh Swidler, which then became a discussion with Jacob Lyons, who Jacob remains one of the co-founders of the Israel-Britain Alliance. We have support from the Paul Singer Foundation. Paul Singer, I regard as a saint in human form, because he makes significant investments supporting Israel across the world. And, you know, he's been lucky enough that he's a wealthy man and he can afford to do it. But just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you're going to do the right thing. He set up a trust fund, which every year spends millions, tens of millions of dollars supporting causes that support Israel. And that's something that we have got help from them, which has enabled us to do our work. Josh and Jacob continue to give their support financially, and we have had others coming in and supporting us, which has meant that we can spend money in terms of creating video content, creating the campaigns, issuing all that to our supporters. And the key for us is to make our supporters make it as simple as possible for them to participate in campaigns. And I know, for example, Robin participates in all our campaigns, and hopefully he'll give us a testimony in a moment or so, telling everyone how easy and simple it is to do so. But we take all the pain out. There was a woman wrote to me once and said, "Great what you do. I used to just shout at the television when something came on about Israel and it was critical of Israel. I used to shout at the television." She said, "My television's covered in cornflakes because every time I'm having my breakfast, I'm shouting at the TV and my anger against the what's been said." She says, "But now I can channel that force to good work because I participate in your campaigns. I force my MP to pick up these issues and to develop, to respond to me and to explain why they're taking positions." And the funny thing is, you know, here's where the change comes. Remember, I was telling you a moment ago about the three groups of MPs, the ambiguous group, the supporters, and the ones that are against. Well, here's what happens now. They're getting lots of communications from pro-Israel advocates. The people who are against us, well, they have to think twice. They have to think, if I say to this person I don't agree with them, you know, is that the way I want to go? Do I want to offend them? Because if 20 people write to you, that's 20 people, individuals, 20 people who have families, 20 people who have groups of friends, and it snowballs from there. That's always a calculation that politicians make. So therefore, unless you've got a majority which is gigantic, then you'll always have to think twice. So we can make the people who are against Israel tone their language down a bit, which is also always good. The ambiguous group in the middle, well, let me tell you, if they are cowardly and they just go with the flow, if they receive 20 letters from the pro-Israel lobby in their constituency and 20 letters from the anti-Israel lobby in their constituency, guess what they'll do? They'll take cover, they'll hide, they won't say anything. And saying nothing is far, far better than coming in and saying something critical of Israel. And finally, our group of supporters in Parliament, and there are a good number of them, particularly in the Conservative benches, some on the Labour side, I say some because most of them don't have the courage to speak up. Liberal Democrats, I would put in the same ballpark. They don't have a lot of courage to speak up. But the situation is, those who do support us, we give them courage, we give them information, we give them facts, and hopefully we give them, instill in a bit of backbone to stand up for what they believe in. And that has meant that we have, in a very short time, from February 2016, when we set up the IBA, to date, just celebrating our anniversary, we have sent a total of over 400,000 emails. We have ran 30 plus campaigns, and we have had massive victories. Not only the ones that I mentioned, we also managed to convince the government to ban Hezbollah. we've held events in the House of Commons with members of the IDF. We were the first organisation to take reserve forces, people who serve in the IDF military into the House of Commons to answer the whole question of proportionality and to put them in front of MPs to say, well, here you are, here's the guys up in the front line. Here are the people who are serving, trying to protect their country. And the crucial thing for me, to any politician about military action, then nobody wants to see anyone on our planet be killed, maimed, or injured through violence. But sadly, we live in a world where there are bad people and people make wrong decisions. And I said this to Ed Miliband when he came out with a rather trite point during Operation Protective Edge. I said, this is probably why I never got very far when he was a leader. Not that I would have wanted to with him as a leader, but my claim to fame is for the whole 5 years, I never once get my picture taken with him, which I'm sure you'll applaud me for. But this is what he said. I said, he was talking about, it's terrible seeing these pictures on the television. And this is all pictures where, Hamas are firing rockets from civilian areas. Israel is responding, taking as much care as possible to stop collateral damage. And Ed Miliband doesn't understand that dynamic. And I said to him, you want to be the Prime Minister of this country. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. Bear in mind, this is 2013, 2014. And I said to him, if someone is bombing Glasgow or London or Belfast or Cardiff, and you're the Prime Minister, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, we have to have the same amount of deaths before I'm going to fire any rockets at anyone else? Or are you going to defend your border security, your country's security, or borders, and take action that's necessary, just as the Israelis do? And of course, answer came there, none. He didn't respond, which I always feel is a giveaway when it comes to someone who hasn't got the courage of the convictions to do what they should do. So that's where we are. The final point I would make is this to all of you. One of the things I am delighted about is that in 2016, in 2015, 2016, when I was speculating about how we could make Israel advocacy work, that's all I was doing. I was speculating. I was using my view that there's loads of Israel supporters out there. I was guessing they were out there, but they just never been spoken to. Because if they hadn't been out there, none of this would have happened. We have gone from zero to sending tens of thousands of pieces of correspondence, to defending Israel in times of crisis, to ensuring that pro-Israel voices and positive voices for peace, because remember, that's what we all want. We want a peace settlement in the Middle East, however that looks in the future. And ultimately, I'm delighted that we've proven that we can all work together and make our voices heard. In 2022, we have plans to do more. And one of the things that I should tell you is that in terms of our finances, as well as some of the larger donations which take care of the big ticket items like the computer system and the licenses that we have to buy to ensure that we've got the most up-to-date information of politicians and so on. Do you know that last year we received £20,000 in donations, and £5, £10, £20 donations from our supporters across the country? I think that's an incredible testament to the people that support us, but also demonstrates that people want to be part of the solution. They want to be part of a positive solution and to promote Israel, to support Israel, and to promote and support the Anglo-Israel relationship. Now, as you probably see by my grey beard and grey head, I've not went prematurely grey. It is genuine, and I want to be in a position in the not too distant future that when I come to take retirement and hang up my boots and spend more time with the family, I want to hand this on to someone in really good shape. And so 2022, hopefully, will be another stepping stone, a positive stepping stone to a brighter future for the Israel-Britain alliance. And if there's any of you guys who I'm watching and looking at on my screen just now who have never participated in a campaign, then I would suggest that now is the time to do so. We started one today. It's against the boycotts, divestments and sanctions movement against Israel. It leans on the fact that we know the government plans to introduce legislation this year which will outlaw boycotts of Israel, and that will be another death knell for the people in this country who support and try to create victims out of the Palestinian people. The only people that make the Palestinians victims are their leaders. And with that, Chair, it's up to you. I can send you the link and you can distribute it to everyone in the call tonight if you want to make the maximum amount of time for questions and answers. But we've got a campaign video which has got all the links for how you can join the campaign too. So happy to fit in with whatever you would prefer.
I think that's probably the best way to do it, Michael. If you send the link to, send the link to me, and then I'll pass it around to those who can pass it on to others. Great. I think that's probably the best thing to do. And I can I can attest that it is relatively easy to follow the instructions that you get inside the emails that you get from the IBA to send an automated correspondence to your MP, and if there's a Minister of State that's copied in on that, then that will all happen automatically. I have to say that when I lived in the previous constituency, I got a reply every time from that particular MP. In the constituency I'm living in at the moment, it's a pro-Palestinian, pro-Corbynite Labour MP, and he rarely, if ever, even bothered, and Michael knows who it is, he rarely even bothers to acknowledge my correspondence. But anyway, you know, you just keep pressing away. So don't let your MP's reaction put you off. Just keep pestering them. You know, and this is a very good way of doing it.
On that point, the point that you made about every single letter that we sent is sent to MPs, but it's also copied to the government department concerned. There's a reason for that. Do you remember I talked about Daniel Taub? Ever since Daniel Taub, not one Israeli ambassador, not the current ambassador, not Mark Reged before, has been called back to the Foreign Commonwealth Office for a démarche. Correct. That means, and even if they were, I would be able to supply the Israeli ambassador with the precise numbers of correspondence that had been sent supporting Israel and supporting the Anglo-Israel relationship. And that's why it's a double-pronged sword. That it means that, yeah, communications are going to the MP, but they're also going to the government department concerned, and they're being logged there. All the numbers are logged, and that's important.
Great. Okay, has anybody got any questions? Either if you can raise your electronic hand or wave your hand in the air if you don't know how to stick the little yellow hand up. Anybody got a question for Michael while we have him here?
Well, I'll ask you one, Michael. We've got some people on here from Ukraine, Brazil and France. Is there anything you would recommend to them at all?
Well, one of the things that we are trying to do, and hopefully will success in the coming years, is to link countries up. And the technology that we've built, some of it's bespoke, some of it is open source, but the technology that we've built can be replicated for every country across the globe. And my vision, if we have the resources to do it, is to connect every country up so that we can't just campaign inside our own countries, but we can also campaign on an international front. So therefore, we could take on the United Nations on some of the crazy decisions that it makes, and we can take on, the World Bank, the World Food Organization, organizations that have in the past been critical of Israel because of giving out misinformation about the state of Israel. So therefore, my grand hope and desire, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility, to link Europe up with the APAC and the US, and then the Pacific and Australia region of the world, and we could really build up a powerful coalition which would start to really take on these horrible myths and lies that have been perpetrated for not decades, not even hundreds of years, but millennia.
Okay, there are several people who've got their electronic hand up. So Roger and Jane, and then Sergey, and then Joanna, and then Ian Downey, in that order, please. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Michael. It was really interesting. Thank you. It's my understanding that the Palestinians and the Arab nations, they will. I'm just wondering how you say that, you know, your aim is peace, but if their aim is to completely annihilate Israel, how can there ever be peace? I mean, how do you envisage peace coming about?
Do you want me to take them all together or answer?
No, one at a time is probably better.
Yeah. Well, look, let me make this point to you. The Abraham Accords. Who would have thought that we would have been in a position that we would have the UAE and Bahrain now on friendly terms with Israel? My old friend, Eitan Nahi, who was the deputy ambassador to the UK while I was serving in Parliament, Eitan is now the Israeli ambassador to Bahrain. Now, that would never have been thought of. We know that the key linchpin who's creating all the hatred in the Middle East is Iran. They have got hegemonic ambitions across the whole of the region. They supply Hamas with weapons. They supply Hezbollah with weapons. They are the malignant force. If the world comes together, and I know it's a big if, and defeats Iran, and there was a change of politics in Iran, then we have the prospect of a strengthening of the normalization across the Middle East, which is currently taking place, because we know that you know I don't want to get too in depth about this, but the Shias and the Sunnis, you know, we know the different brands and branches of Islam who come to get Iran being the Shia, Saudi Arabia being the Sunnis, and we know there's a deep mistrust and hatred between those countries, and it may be that you know two negatives make a positive, and that if Iran can be marginalized, then more progress can be made in the Abraham Accords. And if the Palestinians, people like Mahmoud Abbas, who is now in his 17th year of his 4-year term, if people like Mahmoud Abbas see the writing on the wall and realize that change must come, that they have to negotiate, they have to discuss, then perhaps we have got the openings for a peace settlement. But here's the crucial thing. In 1947, when the UN recommended partition, it recommended a Jewish state and it recommended an Arab state. That's gone. And you can say anything you want about Donald Trump, but when Donald Trump was in power, he put in place some of his best negotiators to deal with the Middle East issue. And the point, and I was delighted when Jared said this, he said, I'm sorry, if you keep on losing battles and you keep on losing the wars, every time that happens, your position weakens. So as far as I'm concerned, we're not at 1947. We're in 2022, or it'll be 2025 or 2030, perhaps when you and I are long gone. But the bottom line is that you cannot, the whole concept of losing war, starting wars, then losing them, and then you're given some sort of prize as a result of that, that philosophy is never going to work, and it's never going to create a peace settlement. And but I am confident that if you marginalize the Iranian forces and the forces that they're supporting, Hamas and Hezbollah, then we'll be in a stronger position to take steps forward to peace. Never going to be easy. And if you ask me the direct question, do you think it will be achieved in the next 20, 30 years? My answer would probably be no.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Sergey, was there something that you wanted to ask?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Michael. The question is, do you make a distinction between the following definitions: anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist? So if you do, so do you have the different approaches to this group of people?
Thank you, Sergey. It's a great question. And the answer is there is no difference whatsoever between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Zionism is about creating a home for the... There's an argument that before the state of Israel was reborn, yeah, that you could be an anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic. But now that we have a state of Israel, it's been achieved. So therefore, now that we have it, the position is that if you're an anti-Zionist, what you're saying is you do not want Israel to exist as it currently sits. So the question is, where did the Jewish people go? And you're
I'm not talking about those extremes group like this how do you call it? Those who are befriended with Iran, etc.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, for instance, different groups of Hasidic streams like Satmar, Gursk, Sigursk Hasidic groups. They're anti-Zionistic on its theology basis, but they're not anti-Semitic. And these are quite a big groups, because I'm involved in quite a broad discussion with them. And I must say, they are being Jews. They have their own religious convictions, and they're anti-Zionist, but they're not anti-Semitic. That was my question.
You forgive me, Sergei, that I'll defer to an individual's theological knowledge, because I don't claim to be an expert in these matters. I'll look at it through the political lens. And my view, from a political perspective, is that the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same thing. And I'm talking about, in that context, I'm talking about people like Jeremy Corbyn. I'm talking about people like Andrew Slaughter. I'm talking about people who, like Richard Burden. So there's three Labour MPs that I would class as being anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, thank you very much. It's clear. I'm Zionist by my convictions, but I have a different point of view on these things.
Of course,
thank you very much. Thank you.
I think, Sergei, what you need to realize is that the sort of groups that you're highlighting are really very, very small in the UK.
Okay, well, in the UK, but
they're not mainstream Jewish here in the UK. You've got Nachar Karta, who turn up at pro-Palestinian demonstrations here in the UK, but it's usually only literally a handful.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Nachar Karta, because
no, I know, but I'm
talking about moderate groups.
They're part of that stream of Judaism that doesn't believe that the current secular state of Israel should exist. Yes. And they're very, very small in British society, very small.
Yes, but Satmar community is quite large, and they have a really very, very strong influence, for instance, in the state of Israel, in Bnei Barak, for instance. And do you know about the recent issues, within the community? And Sigur community, and I can name you others, and they're anti-Zionist, but definitely they're not anti-Semitic.
No, I know, I understand that, but as I say, within the context of what Michael's talking about,
I see.
It's not a major issue here in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
okay. No problem.
Thank you very much.
All right, Joanna, I think you were next, and then Ian.
Well, I'd like to thank Michael so much for his tireless work with Israel-British Alliance. I met him in, I don't know, I think it was 2016 at the same Shekinah group in Brighton when he came to speak there. And it was just so amazing, so interesting to hear. And from then on, I joined, and I always receive letters from my MP back when the letters are sent out. So please be encouraged if you haven't joined as yet, because it's he just is just so wonderful, a wonderful thing to be doing. Thank you, Michael, so much from the bottom of my heart, because you have the background to be able to that you know all about what has happened in politics. So thank you so much. God bless you.
Robin, I think my mother's joined the call. Joanna, thank you very much for those kind words. It really warms the heart when someone is enjoys receiving the correspondence, enjoys learning about the campaigns, and I think in the last couple of years we've started to use video more, where people can actually see the faces and build up the trust between what we're doing and individuals. And I recognise many of the names that in the screen in front of me from people who have joined campaigns, because I see regularly the email comes in, the email addresses, and as you know, what I also do is I write, when an MP responds, I encourage people to send me the letter they received, and then what I do is I give them a rebuttal letter, because often the first response you get back from MPs are weak. They don't answer the questions that you answered originally, and we therefore put additional pressure on them. And so therefore it's important that, and because of that, I genuinely have built up a relationship with thousands of people across the country, to the point now where the database, Robin, is now 60,000 strong. And I still think we've only scraped the top of the barrel. I think there's many, many more, tens of thousands of people to find who will join and celebrate our cause.
Okay, great. Ian, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your talk this evening. I'm just absolutely delighted with with what you said today. Just to pick up on one point there, I'm delighted to hear that you might be doing something about BDS. I'm quite interested. It seems to me that a lot of people aren't aware of the companies that, I'm talking in the UK, that actually are behind the scenes actually supporting BDS. I mean, some of them do it to a sort of, like a quiet way, in as much that they actually say that they only boycott certain things. I was shocked when I found out that the Co-op supermarket actually supports BDS. And when I've actually tried to find a list of companies, I've just been looking again online whilst we've been talking, and I can see a lot of organisations, of course, classic UK trade unions and people like that support BDS openly. Is it possible for you to let your supporters know? I'm on your emailing list, to let people know who are the companies, because I think that it's actually a very positive move to boycott those who boycott Israel. Like Ben and Jerry, like the Co-op. I never buy. I never buy anything from the Co-op ever again at the moment. And I'd like a way to let them know as well. Really, to be quite honest, I'd like to let them know that people are not buying. They're not going into the shop specifically. It's the only supermarket that there is in my village, and I will not buy anything from it. I will actually drive, 10 minutes to go to my town to actually buy stuff from there, rather than buy anything from the Co-op on that basic. We have to act with our feet. We have to, people vote with their feet. They show their opinions. I'm conscious saying this. I feel sorry for Mark, because Mark's actually lives in an even tinier village, and the only shop in the village is actually the Co-op. So, but if you could let us know somehow, please, I would really appreciate that, if you have that information available. Thank you.
No problem at all, Ian. I can certainly get a hold of that list for you, and I'm liking the colour scheme that is in your background there of our flag, which of course has got the prominent colours of the saltire in it as well, which people shouldn't forget. But let me tell you that in terms of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, there's some key facts to remember. Not only it's a massive trade figures that between Israel and the United Kingdom, the fact that if you get prescribed drugs by your physician, then there's a 1 in 6 chance that it'll be the drugs will come from Teva Pharmaceuticals, which is an Israeli company. So there's lots of links and trade links behind the scenes, and they dwarf the BDS movement. But the great news is, and the reason we've started the boycotts, divestments, and sanction campaign today is this: a couple of years ago, we ran a campaign in BDS highlighting all its flaws and all the lies. And we received a letter back from the government minister, and it said this. It said, and bear in mind this is during COVID, but it said that when the time becomes available, we had raised the issue of local government pension schemes disinvesting in Israel. Now, can you imagine these local government pension schemes are for all the local authorities across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. They're investing tens of millions, billions of pounds every year. That's the earnings, the pension earnings of their employees get invested into the accounts. And what the PSC wanted people to do, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, was to disinvest those funds in any companies related to Israel. So we said to the government, this breached the law, and they had to sort it because it was unacceptable, because we had a situation where local authority pension schemes could be making foreign policy decisions that were contradictory to the UK policy. So therefore, the British government is doing business with Israel, got no problem doing business with Israel, selling things to Israel, buying things to Israel, but with the local government pension scheme saying we're not investing in Israel because we don't believe that we should be doing that. We want to disinvest because the Palestine Solidarity Campaign have told us to do so. And the other thing, Ian, which you touched upon, is that many of the trustees of these these local government schemes are trade union members. And guess where they're getting their instructions from? They're getting them from the McCoskeys of this world, the Marks or Watkins of this world, and all those extreme left trade union leaders. So the position is the government gave us a commitment that they would legislate, and this campaign seeks to seal the deal on that legislation, because we've been told privately by the Conservative Party behind the scenes that in the Queen's speech that's coming up very soon, they will legislate to outlaw all local boycotts. So, but that will be another complete kick in the teeth for the opposition movement in the UK, and I'm delighted about that. And so the more pressure we can put on with this campaign, the stronger we will be. And I'm sure that the government, for all its troubles and travails, and incidentally, all its news, wall-to-wall news coverage about parties and all that carry on. But let me tell you, this government has been good for Israel. Liz Truss has been very, very good in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, making sure that the UK is voting the right way in the UN. We've had a ban Hamas decision from Priti Patel, and very soon we're going to get these boycotts outlawed by Michael Gove. So let's give credit where credit's due, and let's put that final piece of pressure on so that we can win this campaign too.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just a quick one. I want to be very short, Robin.
Okay, please
yeah,
be quick.
I mean, yeah, it's like in some sense what I've said is negative. Also, if you could include with that information anybody that you know that is a positive supporter, that we can also contact them to actually send them our encouragement to say that you know, we are going to spend more money with you because you actually do support Israel. Thank you.
Do.
Thank you.
Okay. 2 more questions, and then we really need to move on in what we need to do tonight. So Bella, you're first, and then Judy.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. I'll just make it quick. I'm a university student at a Bible college, an evangelical Bible college, and when things were heating up with Gaza last year, I got a lot of flack for that, being one of the only supporters of Israel in my school. So I just wondered if you have you had any contact with university students or people in education who, you know, are singled out, who, you know, support Israel, and are one of, you know, many supporters of Palestine? And have you got any advice for me? Because I would like to start, you know, when tensions do rise again, or even not in the midst of tension, probably be better to do it when there isn't tension, like to bring people in a democratic way to, you know, support Israel with me.
Sure.
Sorry, Michael. Can I just, Robin, I think somebody's trying to get in. I've just had a message.
No, there's nobody trying to get in.
Maria from Stenin?
No.
Okay. All right, no problem.
Right. Bella, can I answer that question as follows? Delighted that you've been standing up and you've been brave enough to do what you've been doing. We run the Israel Apartheid Week campaign every single year. We've handed in petitions to 10 Downing Street and so on and so forth. The issue is fundamentally, in terms of universities, and I'll come on to the thing about conflict in a second, is this. The government has adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Part of that says that you can't treat Israel any differently from any other country. And we know that routinely and often our opponents do treat Israel, try to set it apart from any other country in the world. And of course, they try to make the comparison with South African apartheid, which are utter nonsense. Everyone in Israel has rights, and the only problem is that in terms of the disputed territories that have been created, and many would argue are part of the greater Israel, the simple fact of the matter is that the people who have caused all the violence do not want to take on a state. They don't want a Palestinian state. What they do want is they don't want Israel to exist. They don't want an Israeli state to exist. In terms of the problems that you face when conflict occurs, then you have to be brave. But what we want to start to do in terms of the Israel-Britain alliance is put together a coalition of groups that can be supportive to students like yourself to come along physically. I'll come along. I'll stand side by side by you, and I don't mean that in an aggressive or some sort of show of strength way, but just to be with you, to give you that moral strength and support to say, well, we're with you, and if you want, and we'll set up a stall, we'll engage with people and say, well, why have you got a problem? And then speak to them and give them the facts and say, well, this is where I disagree with you. And ultimately, what we tend to find is that the other side are aggressive, they are violent, they don't want to hear the opposite point of view, what we would call the truth. But I can certainly pass on my details via Robin to yourself, and we can take it from there. And if you get any ideas for any local stuff on a campus, incidentally, probably the best time to do that is not during conflict. But I'd be happy to come and speak at an event, not in the university grounds, outside or whatever. Bring along some people who are students that I know, who are a little bit more of your generation rather than mine, and why not? Let's ensure that our message is heard and give people, because there may be more people out there that hold your view, but you don't know about it because they remain quiet because they're frightened.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like that.
Great, fantastic.
Okay, one more question. Judy, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Well, mine's following on from Ian, really, because we have two main shops in Saltdean where I live, and they're both co-ops. Well, I'd stopped using the co-op a long time ago, and it was through a different issue about them being against homosexual. They were promoting the homosexual stuff at some point, so I stopped. I stopped buying from. But it's very difficult when you're in a community, and those are the local shops, and you want to support the local community. So I must say I do buy a few things from the co-op, but I don't like buying them from the co-op. So is there anything we can do sort of to write individual letters to the people at the top of whoever makes those decisions, if we can find the person to write to, and lots of them bombard the co-op with letters?
Well, one of the things that the new system, we were very blessed last year because we received funding which enabled us to build a new IT platform. And I don't say that to frighten you by saying it's all information technology, but what this allows us to do is we can run local campaigns, we can run campaigns which don't necessarily need to go to Parliament, they can go to the Chief Executive of the cooperative. So in terms of, and I know that Luke Akehurst, who I work closely with from We Believe in Israel, Luke has been running a campaign in the cooperative. So again, why don't we touch base after this meeting takes place? We can connect up with Luke and others, and we can determine if there's a local campaign that we can run, which would be, because one of the things, do you remember the Ben and Jerry's announcement last year about saying they weren't going to sell any of their ice cream in the disputed territories? Well, we ran a campaign, I think I mentioned it earlier, against the Unilever chief executive. So we can find out the details of the appropriate person in the cooperative and write to them, giving them the appropriate point of view, and to explain to them, look, there's people genuinely that can have differences of opinion, but there's a woke attitude which really concerns me these days. And I don't think it's just because I'm of a generation that we're out and played in our bogies and we didn't really worry about the health and safety implications. But in case anyone doesn't know what a bogie is, it was when you got the wheels off a pram and you had them and a bit of wood in between, and then you went down the hill on it and you probably nearly toppled it over and done yourself some damage. But there's a woke group of people out there, and they just always default to a position where the guy, there's an Australian thing at the moment where they did a big festival, and the Israeli government ambassador and Israeli embassy sponsored the event by $20,000, and there's all this controversy, and the guy's apologized for taking the money when he should be actually not apologizing. He should be saying to the people that try to shut down this element of entertainment and culture, stop trying to treat Israel differently from any other nation, because that's a breach of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So, in short, Judy, we can get together, we can run a campaign. I'll be happy to do so, and I can liaise with Robin, get your details, and we can kick it up and talk about it with Locatus, that we believe has got some background information about the cooperative.
Okay. All right, Judy?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Mark, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
And
Thank you, Michael.
thank you, Michael, for what you've shared with us this evening. Really appreciate that. Really, thank you for all the hard work that you and your team are putting in.